So, head football coach Rich Rodriguez is making the rounds in the last week on the national shows, both in podcast form and on YouTube, speaking specifically to CBS sports broadcaster Josh Pate's college football kickoff show, as well as ESPN's college GameDay podcast with Rece Davis and Pete Thamel. So, in those two podcasts, and I'm going to leave the links to those two podcasts from YouTube here in the description of this episode for context. I'm going to be about a little over an hour when watching or listening to both. So if you have the time to dedicate that, if you can listen back to those two shows, it'll put into more context of what I'm about to talk about tonight, because I thought they were riveting, because I now get, and this is what I'll give you my unfiltered thoughts on, is kind of a dive into the psyche of Rich Rodriguez and kind of where you can take a short-term, long-term outlook on, what's going to be West Virginia football, or at least the mold, the model, the mantra for these next, the next half decade, I would say, as we round out the 2020s in what is currently now the Big 12 Conference for West Virginia. So thanks for tuning in. If you had a chance to listen to my segment on Locked On West Virginia with Mountaineer Paul last Friday, and you're now tuning into one of my episodes for the very first time, love to have you as a subscriber, and I want to thank Paul once again for having me on for that show. It was a lot of fun to talk about the roster management of this West Virginia football team. We got to talk a little basketball at the end of the show, so really appreciate him having me on the show. And it was one of his things. He was saying, hey, I want to help you out, I want to get you some more subscribers, some more followers on Twitter, stuff like that. So really appreciate him doing that, and we had a lot of fun. So thanks for tuning in. And I guess what I would say is, going back to those couple episodes, I get where Rodriguez wants to go with the program, but also I feel as if there are some pitfalls or some traps into, what could make this an unsuccessful program, or I would just say take a little bit longer, if West Virginia doesn't hit the right marks, strike lightning in a bottle twice, and how college football worked back 20 years ago when he was here the first time, and now where the sport is today. So, rather than me jump back and forth between some of the questions Josh Pate asked and Rece and Pete, I just want to give you my thoughts. And I think what I take away, number one, first and foremost, from those two interviews is that we are going to a team that goes from one that, in Rod's estimation, was soft and lazy, his two most hated four-letter words behind PITT, and one that is hard edge. And that is what he ultimately takes away from what Mountaineer Nation puts their love and respect into Mountaineer football, is one that's going to play hard. Might not necessarily be the best from an X's and O's schematic standpoint, but I would argue, with Travis Trickett alongside Rodriguez manning the controls of the West Virginia offense on fall Saturdays, with Zach Alley and Jeff Castile manning the calls from the defensive perspective on fall Saturdays, that West Virginia is going to be in a pretty good X's and O's standpoint. But it's from the perspective of playing hard every day in practice, and especially on game days, that if you go back and you watch some of those old games from the early 2000s that you can find on YouTube, Maryland 2004, that's one that comes great to mind. UConn 2007, one that comes to mind. Of course, the Sugar Bowl in 2005. There were so many unsung heroes who were just gritty, were just overachievers, who played, above their weight class, tightened their belt, pulled up their bootstraps, and went out there and got it. And that's what, unfortunately, and that where West Virginia fell in a national prestige, I feel like, during the Neil Brown administration. And it's not one I feel like on this channel, I piled on Neil Brown and staff and players during that era a lot. But it's very important for contextual purposes to know the history, because you got to know where you've been to know where you are now. And where West Virginia was, as we remember back in that glory era, it was a program that was respected and, I wouldn't say necessarily feared in the way of, say, in Alabama and Ohio State, mid-teens, Clemson, that kind of way. But it was one that you couldn't just overlook West Virginia, that they were going to scratch and claw and fight for every single second, and you have to bring it. Oklahoma in 2007 learned that in the Fiesta Bowl. Even those amazing LSU games or teams in 2010 and 2011 with so many NFL stars on it, they were close games, especially in 2010. But, too bad Patrick Peterson ran a punt return back and Morris Claiborne ran a kickoff return back. Special teams came into play. But Clemson in 2012, Alabama in 2014 with Clint Trickett and Kevin White, Mario Alford putting the nation on notice with his kickoff return for a touchdown that game. And who can forget the Texas 2018 Classic at DK Royal Stadium where where Will Grier scored the game-winning 2-point conversion. So it's just like big brands couldn't just, say, it's West Virginia. We're going to cakewalk through this. And that was one of the things that dogged Neil Brown throughout his entire time in West Virginia. 3-17 against ranked opponents with an average margin of loss in those games by 12.7 points per game. So that is part of the hard edge mentality that West Virginia has to get back to. And again, competing in every game in which they play, especially against, rivalries who they play in non-conference, the backyard brawl first and foremost this upcoming fall, but also can go against those national blue bloods, contenders, big brands, and put on respectable performances, and then can sometimes win in those games. But also, this might take a little bit of unpacking to do, is unfortunately I feel as if West Virginia developed a loser's mentality during the Neil Brown era that just doomed him basically throughout his entire 6 years, that he was just never able to turn a corner. And I think it all goes back 2019 against Texas Tech at home. I thought it was a homecoming game, but it wasn't. It was a military. It might have been actually like the first true blue military appreciation game, but it was a beautiful day in Morgantown. West Virginia the previous week had played, I think it was on Halloween, and they played against Baylor, who was nationally ranked, and the defense played lights out. Gave every chance for Austin Kendall and the West Virginia offense to turn a corner, and unfortunately they just couldn't against Baylor. I think missed a field goal in that game, lost just close. Well, in the very next week, Jet Duffy and the Texas Tech Red Raider offense ran roughshod over West Virginia's defense, if you recall. They were up 35-10 at halftime and coasted to a 38-17 win, easily. In 2019, West Virginia kind of came on strong toward the end of the season, winning against TCU, Texas, Kansas State. At that point in time, no Marcus Sims, no Kenny Robinson on that team, so had some overachievers in some position groups, but missing clearly their two stars. And then they went into that upcoming off season. Again, COVID happened. We can recall the Vic Kenning defensive coordinator firing and storm that happened because of Kerry Martin. But also in that 2020 season, West Virginia suffered a 42-6 regular season finale loss to Iowa State. And going into that offseason, after Jordan Leslie was promoted to the defensive coordinator, Jamal Adai left to go to Georgia. The ultimate sin kind of happened at that point in time when the transfer portal was free at that point in time. Then NIL was becoming a thing that upcoming summer, July 1st. And the player who I really pin it back to in addition, in some what the barnstorm that happened with the Kerry Martin situation was Tyke Smith. Tyke Smith was, I think, like an honorable mention, All-American stud, and going with Jamal Adai to the University of Georgia. I ended up having a great career, but it just proved at that point in time that there was this attitude, started by Tyke Smith, and we saw how then that proliferated over to the next year with Akeem Mesidor, 4 different cornerbacks ending up leaving the program, which has set West Virginia back now another 4 years because of that 1 year in which there was a mass exodus at that one position in cornerback, in that there was a mentality I feel like that developed, and some of it was, had to do with some of the players that were holdovers from the Dana Holgorsen era who were bigger individuals putting themselves over the team. And that combined with the efforts of, again, going to and winning a close Liberty Bowl in 2020, not making a bowl game in 2019, and then in 2021, very paltry achievements with Jarrett Deggy at quarterback, 6-7. 2022 was probably the season that Neil Brown should have been fired. But it was just the timing of Shane Lyons being fired, Ren Baker coming in, giving the vote of confidence with President Gordon Gee to give Neil Brown an extra year, and boom, past expectations in 2023. But it was just that there was an attitude, I feel like, from within the locker room of not necessarily buying into the trust the climb mantra, not having the on-field success, and not putting many players into the National Football League as I've contending for conference championships. So you see how this built from 2019 all the way down to 2021. And where I would parlay, what also doomed Neil Brown was that after he got the contract extension, going from 2020 to 2021, getting that vote of confidence from the athletic director, had some players at some valuable positions coming back. But this is where also the cupboard being bare going into 2019, that Dana Holgorsen left 2 years down the road when those players should have been upperclassmen, that West Virginia didn't do enough at that point in time with the transfer portal and getting high quality high school recruits into the program at those 3 first recruiting classes that Neil Brown had of trying to go after Troy recruits, that he said going into that offseason that Jarrett Deggy was the most improved player of anyone on West Virginia's team. And what does he do week 1 in a road contest at Maryland, but absolutely really blows the game for the Mountaineers in a game that still has cut me so deep being there in person. So I think at that point in time, and standing by, for that whole season, Jarrett Deggy in 2021, that Neil Brown lost the trust, lost the credibility, lost the support of the big booster donors who, as we've seen now, have come home for Coach Rodriguez and giving him and the West Virginia NIL operation collective that's all now in-house as part of the Mountaineer Athletic Club, all of the financial resources that it's needed to go out there and get 74 newcomers as of this video's recording, between high school, JUCO, Division II, FCS, G6, and Power 4 transfers. So that is me connecting some dots there as to why West Virginia, and I think also NIL being new, but why was West Virginia one of the most poached programs in the entire country is because you had apathetic players on the team who weren't buying into the trust the climb system, mantra, everything at that point in time. Also, the on-field success, and just perhaps not seeing Neil Brown as this authoritative figure at the helm of the program who's going to dictate terms to the players. And again, I know this coincided with really the beginning of the player empowerment movement in college football that in all of college sports that we're seeing today. But it's just like the stake in the ground that Rich Rodriguez has now taken was completely opposite from what I feel like that Neil Brown happened. And then just some of the blowouts that West Virginia had. Looking this up, 2022, West Virginia did not even look competitive in that road contest against Texas. Also got blown out by 38 at Texas Tech. I thought Neil Brown should have been fired after the away Iowa State loss. That was a team that I think finished 4-8. And West Virginia looked terrible, lost by 17. In 2023, the two games that it played against ranked opponents, Penn State and Oklahoma, it lost by more than 3 scores. And then, of course, 2024, we know how that all ended. So, all of this is to say that the time for a reset, a refresh, and a purge of this roster was well due. So that's why when national news was made, across social media when the transfer portal opened just about a month ago, and there was this mass exodus of players, that's where I'm saying that was a blessing in disguise for some of them. Now, there's a handful. There are a handful of guys. If you don't want to necessarily consider the character, just the way the on-field production, I can think of, a Tomas Remek on the offensive line, how many years that he'd started. Of course, C.J. Donaldson, my guy. Hudson Clement, Josiah Trotter. There are some obvious losses that if you were pointing to a statistic like wins above replacement, that if West Virginia had on this year's roster, that I think would be equal to or additions over what West Virginia has currently that it's brought in from the transfer portal. But there's this adage, you see this sometimes in business, you can see this in organizations. Sometimes you just need to clean house. You need to wipe out the old, in with the new. And there was clearly a divide between not only the resources, that was invested for the NIL purposes, but I just think the attitude, the and perspective, at that head coaching position, that it was, whether or not you agree with whether it would have been better for West Virginia to go out there for another head coach or Rich Rodriguez is up for debate, and we'll be able to analyze that over the next several years. But there was no doubt that Neil Brown needed to be fired. And here's where I think that's the difference in mentality that Rich Rodriguez is going for, and why this is perfect timing is the transfer portal. If there's, and in those couple of interviews, and he says this word a lot, entitlement, if there's any sorts of an entitlement or, me before we, or the financial, ramifications, play a part, which I think have dogged some programs out there. If this, the collective and how they're getting paid, I think that was played a part in Oklahoma State over the last couple of seasons for one, in the Big 12 Brethren, that he's going to swap somebody else in. You are an interchangeable part. And, I hate to have to say that because we bleed old gold and blue, and these players play a part in that and for the team and the program and the university and the state and everything. But that's what it's going to come down to, is that your individual interests, financial, playing time, anything, come behind the team. And that is what made those 2000s teams great. And Rich Rodriguez and staff will find you if you can play. If you have the talent, you have the attitude, you have the drive, you are going to see the field. And I don't care whether your name is now Cannon Katzer from Ferris State Division II, or your name is Jaheim White and you were, a freshman All-American 2 seasons ago. That you are playing for the team. And with that hard edge, we're going to hit a lot in practice. We're going to hit there will be some injuries, probably more so than Neil Brown. Listened to Neil Brown enough that they tried to do some different things in practice, both in the spring and in the fall, to limit hits to the actual ground to avoid injury. That's not going to be a thing under Rich Rodriguez, I feel like. He's just, again, if a linebacker tackling a tight end and one guy's slow to get up, bam, new one's going to be in there. And that is the mentality, iron sharpens iron, that you're going to have to bring whenever you're a part of the Mountaineer program. And also, if you there is the door. If you're not signed up for any of this, you don't buy in, you don't, become, in a way part of the cult and what this program stands for and the standards that are highly going to be set for you, there is going to be the door. And that's why I think if we didn't have the free transfers that we had of just pre 5 years ago and earlier, this rebuild for Rich Rodriguez probably would have taken a lot longer, because he would have had to play and try and change the attitudes. I don't know how you do that of these, kind of me first players that were within the program. Instead, let them walk and go find new ones at all different levels. Like, as I said, all the way down from Division II in the JUCO, all the way other to, SEC and Big Ten schools that are guys that want to have playing time and compete for a starting position. So that's where I see that as a benefit. And that's why I would say when you're thinking about, or you have these questions from coworkers or family or friends about how good is West Virginia going to be this year, and I'll break that down schematically as I get to know more about these players in the system. I've already kind of taken a dive into what Rodriguez and team were like at Jacksonville State a year ago. Also listened to a really good interview with Travis Trickett earlier this evening on the Three Guys Before the Game podcast, and kind of talking about the assistant coaching staff. And I haven't even talked about those guys and kind of what they bring from an attitude perspective, and how Rodriguez told them all right when the transfer portal, right when he got here, he wanted every single assistant coach to scout every player in the transfer portal, every single one of them. There's thousands, and they went out there and scouted to find these guys. But that's what it takes. Now, the challenge is, I feel like, to this being a successful, this is really a social experiment, if you want to go and call it that, once again, with bigger ramifications than it was whenever Rich Rodriguez took the job in 2001. First of all, the professionalization of the collegiate game and mentality of players today is totally different. And what I mean by that is, you can let the players walk nilly-willy as they please, but if you have too many of them who are your stars and are of your top talent, and maybe just don't necessarily jive with that kind of authoritative figure and buy-in, and want to go there, go somewhere else, maybe it's a little more fun, or they get West Virginia gets negatively recruited or by an opposing team, and someone tries to tamper with one of their players to then we'll take you. If you have enough good players who do that, that creates challenges for you. And also the challenges of recruiting to West Virginia continue and have not changed for so very long. If that it's a state that sometimes gets negative stereotypes written against it, for whatever reason, in the year of our Lord 2025, ESPN broadcasters still want to say that it is Western Virginia. So you have to battle with that. And then also necessarily if the buy-in to the culture isn't necessarily there of what I'm talking about. So West Virginia is not going to appeal to everybody out there. Can you appeal to high enough caliber talent? And then the onus is really just going to be on Rodriguez and staff to go out there and find those diamonds who are gems in the rough. Gems who are diamonds in the rough, like Pat White, who was a converted wide receiver commit to LSU that West Virginia recruited to get a quarterback, or an Owen Schmidt, who was a D3 transfer from Wisconsin River Falls. There's so many countless examples that West Virginia is going to have to operate surgically, especially when it comes to recruitment, and the development should take care of itself. In this system, hard edge, earned success model. But, if you're not going to operate like a New York Yankees or a Los Angeles Dodgers in the SEC or Big Ten with ESPN and Fox Sports money, you'll have that hanging over your head. You have whether Gen Z players who might want to make a TikTok dance or two video, not jiving with the West Virginia culture, attitude, everything that Rich Rodriguez and staff are trying to protrude into these players. And also you have the Rodriguez answered this question of, you ask a kid 20 years ago, so probably like my generation or a little bit older, the millennial generation, go run through a brick wall, they'll go and do it. But you ask a Gen Z player today, he's going to ask why. So if West Virginia doesn't have on-field success, I feel like from the jump, depending upon how, I don't know how I'm not going to make any sort of bold predictions just yet for this video, but if West Virginia goes in and you can see progression as the season goes along from September to October to November, whether they make a bowl game or not, contend for a Big 12 championship or not, there has to be visual, tangible, statistical evidence that can be pointed to that, man, this team got better as the season went along. And man, when they go up against Utah, or if you go up against, let's go with one of their last games of the season, Texas Tech, Arizona State, that they're going to battle and they're going to play hard, and whether they win or lose, it's going to be a tough out no matter what. Because that's what a player like a Tyke Smith didn't buy into. What the kid who left for Drayshawn Miller didn't buy into, even though it sounds like allegedly years ago Auburn dropped a bag into his hands, but still he never ended up playing at Auburn for those last couple of years after having a all Big 12 caliber season in 2020. So what I think that now Rodriguez and staff are doing, using this transfer portal wisely to, and he's taking as I've used this example from the past, in the past on my channel, is he's taking the Johnny Majors approach. Back in the 1970s, Johnny Majors for the University of Pittsburgh made his mark by recruiting 10 to 12 running backs to find one Tony Dorsett. And what do you know? Rode him to a national championship and a Heisman Trophy. So West Virginia is going out there. They're recruiting 12 wide receivers. How many offensive linemen do they now have into the system? How many defensive backs? They are going to use this summer, then of course August training camp, to try and go out there, whittle down from a really bloated depth chart down to a 2 deep that, again, they can practice hard, hit, be physical. Again, it's going to be a military-esque like practice schedule, just like the spring was, going hard all the time, and then you have to show that on game day when West Virginia plays. So I'd love to know your thoughts now, almost a half hour into this. Am I making any sense? Because that's what I feel like. Before we jump ahead of ourselves and start evaluating this, rosters too deep, and look at the schedule and go week by week, game by game, and start to try and project over these next several months, which is going to be, I feel like, impossible because, as I said on the program with Paul, I feel like come Big 12 Media Day, we're going to have more oars on the roster than you're going to have at a rowing regatta. You are not going to really necessarily understand this too deep, and we're probably not going to even through the month of September. At Jacksonville State, Rich Rodriguez and co started out 0-3, and it really took until they could turn a corner, after having some growing pains. So you hope that for West Virginia's sake, they have about 3 weeks of growing pains. They got RMU, they got Ohio. Then they have the backyard brawl at home. Thank God that game is at home. Rich Rodriguez was politicking a lot with the game day crew, and they were kind of, I feel like, buying it. Rece and Pete Thamel were buying it of like, oh man, they understand the storylines, and also bringing Pat McAfee back. It's September 13th of all dates, 9/13. Rich Rod's first, return back to Morgantown since that game in 2007. It's nice. the tour of reliving the past is going to end once the start of the season. So for now, I'm enjoying it. I like looking back and thinking about all of these times, but there will be a new era starting it off with kickoff for that game number 1 against Robert Morris. But I'm not naive to think that there won't be some growing pains along the way. But I still think there's enough talent on this roster that West Virginia is going to be a tough out against the majority of its games on its schedule. I won't give away kind of who are the teams that I'm necessarily fearing on paper as of right now, but you can just take it from me that I feel like West Virginia, while still being a group of individuals, not necessarily a team just now, I feel like have not taken such a dramatic step back from a talent perspective because of the attitude adjustment that was desperately needed because of, during the Neil Brown regime. Not only from a schematic standpoint, game planning, game calling, everything, and how terrible West Virginia was on defense. You're already going to have an upgrade over a Jordan Leslie-led defense, and the defensive backfield of Aiden Garnes and Dantes Fagan and Garnet Hollis Jr. I guarantee you West Virginia is going to be better than with those 3 players out of the program and replacing them. So that's where I feel like we need to take a step back, and I can understand the 30,000-foot view of the program of Rich Rodriguez is going to try and first and foremost change the loser's mentality that was in this locker room to one that is going to be one that's confident of itself because it plays with a hard edge all game long, every single game. And they're going to go out there and they're going to compete and contend, and they're going to get back to a standpoint of where they can go toe-to-toe with some of those nationally ranked premier brands of college football again. Might not be in 2025. Might take into 2026 or beyond. And what can derail that potentially is if there's not a buy-in into this culture, the challenges in recruiting that West Virginia still faces now with the behemoths of the SEC and the Big Ten and what they have so greedy and power hungry because of what ESPN and Fox can feed them. But that West Virginia can be surgical, be like a Tampa Bay Rays or a Baltimore Orioles, to use a baseball analogy here, to go out there and find talent at some of the lesser divisions in college football or at some other programs of guys who are just chomping at the bit for an opportunity to start, and you're going to have to weed through them to get to a starting 2 deep. And then hopefully by then, with some success, wins and losses, contending for national championships, putting some guys, or at least more guys than Neil Brown was putting into the NFL, that is what's going to attract higher caliber high school recruits to get into the system. I would really love it. I would really truly love it. And who knows, maybe down the road there's an opportunity, because what does getting a star out of high school mean anymore? Unless you're a Ryan Williams or a Jeremiah Smith who can make that year 1 kind of impact at a high enough level that you're all conference or all American, going out there and getting 5-star players only to be poached in the transfer portal the next offseason doesn't mean much. So I'd love to have Chris Henry Jr. on this program. Absolutely freaking would love it. But right now, would you rather go play for the defending national champion Ohio State Buckeyes, who have now, it seems like, become wide receiver U in college football, or to a rebuilding program in West Virginia when you have your sights on making it to the National Football League and you're a 5-star recruit? So would love to have Chris Henry Jr. into the program. And maybe if Chris Henry Jr. Came 2 years down the road, there might be enough writing on the wall to say, yes, I want to make this kind of investment of myself into a program like this. Now, if this was 20 years ago, it got a player like Noel Devine to come to West Virginia. And I love that they talked about this on the College Game Day podcast of how close West Virginia was to getting Terrell Pryor and how that could have been absolutely game-changing for the program for the next 4 years after Pat White graduated. So I think this is a perfect spot. I think this is a perfect time for a coach like Rich Rodriguez to come in. And he's one who has national championship aspirations. I don't think that he has his sights on any bigger programs like a Michigan out there, or to go to the NFL at his age, having done that, having traveled far and wide. So he wants to build a program. And at 61 years old, he's got about another decade or so, if that's how far along he wants to continue coaching, and wants to, because this is a grind. I feel like West Virginia fans should be thankful, even ones who weren't necessarily thrilled with the idea of bringing him back day one when he was hired pre-Pat McAfee introductory press conference show, that he has worked his tail off. He's uberly competitive to a point that not even in Neil Brown's not even the same stratosphere. And then that's trickling down to the assistant coaches, having a nice blend of older veteran coaches and some young up-and-comers who are hungry and also going to be deployed heavily on the recruiting trail. And then having the transfer portal to siphon out the bad eggs who are out of the batch. Or, as I kind of chronicled on the last video, I made for this channel, the guys who just weren't Power 4 caliber players, just talent identification, just not well conducted by Trey Nair, Drew Fabianich, Neil Brown, and the rest of the assistant coaches at that point in time. To clean house, new attitude, and then come in there and make your mark on the program. So, love to know your thoughts, good, bad, or indifferent. Tell your friends, tell your family, tell your dog that I do this each and every week and have a lot of fun doing it. And I think we're going to kind of transition, kind of put a pause, I feel like, on football. I know West Virginia just now got another transfer portal recruit, and since I did my show about a week ago talking about all the transfer portal success West Virginia's had, it's had another influx of players come in. So goodness, I feel like we could talk about this till the cows come home. But we have a team in a baseball program that's on the precipice, winning a Big 12 regular season title. Don't want to jinx anything, knock on wood. But we're going to be watching the baseball team over this upcoming weekend series at Kansas State. Next week at home against Kansas. I think my plans are to be at Saturday's game, so maybe see West Virginia, celebrating a Big 12 regular season championship that could propel them into the Big 12 tournament, which is now single elimination this year, in sights of trying to host a regional. So perfect example. All of the changes that the West Virginia base, not from a lineup standpoint, but at least from a pitching staff, what Steve Sabins was able to do for this upcoming, from this season, to really not skip a beat, it seems like, coming from the Randy Mazey era. So I would say, if you're looking at this college football season for West Virginia, to count on the kind of team and wins and loss and everything else as the floor of what Neil Brown did, of what we're going to see for the West Virginia is not going to fall off an absolute cliff and go somewhere in the ballpark of 3-9. Even I feel like 5-7 or worse, miss out on a bowl. I know they're over/under win-loss of going across the different gambling websites is set somewhere around 5.5. So I feel a little more confident than that, and we'll talk about that as the summer goes along. So we'll put a pause, at least for now, on football. Come back and talk baseball very soon. But I'd love to know your thoughts. Leave your comments here on YouTube, and would love to have you as a subscriber to my channel if you like what you're hearing. Check out some of my other videos as well. So thanks for tuning in, everybody. Let's go. Hail West Virginia. Spot the ball.